The ship that froze distance. How one sailing voyage in 1882 put the whole world on your plate. Consider, for a moment, the strangest ordinary fact in your kitchen. The lamb in a London supermarket may have been raised 11,000 miles away, on a hillside in New Zealand, and it will often be cheaper than meat raised 50 miles up the road. We treat this as unremarkable. For almost the whole of human history it would have been not merely surprising but physically impossible, because meat, unlike wheat or wool or timber, rots. Distance was a wall around every dinner table. What finally broke that wall was not the steamship or the telegraph, but a converted sailing ship with a coal-fired freezing machine bolted into her hold, and a captain willing to crawl inside it. The problem, in the late 19th century, had two halves that fit together like a lock and key. In Britain, the industrial cities were hungry. Populations had exploded, wages were rising, and the appetite for meat far outran what British pastures could supply. For the working family, meat remained a luxury eaten sparingly. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, the young colony of New Zealand had the opposite affliction: absurd abundance. Its green hills carried some 13 million sheep, raised chiefly for wool, and once a sheep's fleece days were over, the animal itself was nearly worthless. There were only so many mouths in the colony. Surplus sheep were boiled down for tallow, candle fat, or, in the bleakest years, simply driven over cliffs. Two economies, each starving for what the other threw away, separated by 11,000 miles of ocean and one unbreakable law: flesh spoils. Refrigeration itself was not the missing piece. Machines that could make cold existed, brewers and meat packers used them on land, and in 1877 the French steamer Frigorifique had carried chilled beef from Argentina to France as a proof of concept, and in 1879 the Strathlevin had landed a small cargo of Australian frozen beef in London. But New Zealand's case was the extreme test. The voyage from Port Chalmers to London was among the longest in the world, around the bottom of the planet, 3 months at sea, crossing the full furnace of the tropics twice, in an age when most of the route had to be sailed, not steamed. If frozen meat could survive that journey, it could survive anything. The man who decided to try was William Solto Davidson, the managing director of the New Zealand and Australian Land Company, a Scot who had studied the earlier experiments and concluded that the technology was ready even if the nerve of his rivals was not. In 1881 he committed his company to the gamble. The vessel chosen was the Dunedin, a handsome iron-hulled clipper of about 1,320 tons, built on the Clyde in 1874 to carry emigrants and wool. Into her hold went a Bell Coleman compression freezing plant, powered by a coal-fired steam engine. The machine could chill the hold to more than 20 degrees below the outside air temperature and hold it there, provided the engine kept turning, day and night, for the entire voyage. A sailing ship would cross the world's warmest oceans with a fire burning in her belly to keep her cargo colder than winter. The first attempt, in late 1881, ended in farce and frustration. The machinery broke down with the sheep carcasses already aboard, and the whole cargo had to be sold off locally before it spoiled. Davidson repaired, reloaded and tried again. On the 15th of February, 1882, the Dunedin cleared Port Chalmers, near the city whose name she carried, loaded with roughly 5,000 carcasses, 4,331 mutton, 598 lamb, 22 pig, together with kegs of butter, some 2,226 sheep's tongues, and a garnish of hare, pheasant, turkey and chicken. 98 days of ocean lay ahead. The voyage nearly failed in the cruelest way. Becalmed in the tropics, with the sail slack and the sun hammering the deck, the crew discovered that the cold air in the hold was not circulating. Pockets of the cargo were beginning to warm. The ship's master, Captain John Whitson, did what the age of sail expected of its captains: he went in himself. Crawling into the freezing chamber among the hanging carcasses, he sought extra air passages to restore the circulation, and stayed at it so long in the brutal cold that he was overcome, and his crew had to haul him out and revive him. The story, which sounds invented, is soberly recorded in New Zealand's official history: the captain who nearly froze to death in the tropics to save 5,000 frozen sheep. He saved them. When the Dunedin docked in London in late May 1882, the hold was opened with the trepidation of men lifting a coffin lid, and the meat came out hard, sweet and sound. Of the whole cargo, a single carcass was condemned. The mutton sold briskly at Smithfield Market at roughly twice what it would have fetched in New Zealand, and buyers remarked that it arrived in better condition than cargoes from nearer Australia. The experiment was not a modest success, it was a thunderclap. Within 5 years, 172 frozen meat shipments had left New Zealand for Britain, and only a handful arrived with any significant spoilage. Freezing works sprang up around the colony's ports. Sheep, once valued only in wool, were now bred for the table. The fat lamb trade was born, and with it, in time, national icons like the Canterbury lamb on British Sunday tables. The consequences ran far beyond one colony's balance sheet. For New Zealand, refrigeration was nothing less than an economic constitution. For the next century, the country's prosperity was built on shipping frozen meat and chilled butter to a market on the opposite side of the planet, a national livelihood conjured out of thin, cold air. For Britain, the flood of cheap Antipodean and Argentine meat helped put regular meat on working-class plates for the first time in the nation's history. And for the world, the Dunedin's voyage proved the principle behind what we now call the cold chain, that unbroken corridor of refrigeration running from farm to ship to warehouse to the supermarket shelf, along which nearly everything perishable in your kitchen has traveled. The banana, the vaccine, the sushi-grade tuna, all of them ride a road first surveyed by a sailing ship full of mutton. It is worth dwelling on how close-run the whole enterprise was. The freezing machinery of 1882 was temperamental, hand-tended and hungry. The Dunedin burned through some 3 tons of coal a day simply to keep her cargo winter-cold under a tropical sun, with sparks from the funnel more than once singeing the sails above. Had Whitson's cargo spoiled, investors on both sides of the world stood ready to declare the whole idea a folly, and the colony's freezing works might have waited another decade for their capital. Instead, one sound cargo turned skepticism into a stampede, and the lesson stuck. In infrastructure, a single unarguable demonstration is worth 1,000 prospectuses. What the Dunedin proved, the world's shipowners industrialized with astonishing speed. The sailing clipper with a freezing plant was a transitional creature, magnificent and brief. Within a decade, purpose-built refrigerated steamers, reefers, in the trade's blunt vocabulary, were running scheduled cold services across every ocean. Argentina and Uruguay poured chilled and frozen beef into Europe from the River Plate, Australia expanded its own frozen trade, and the dairy followed the meat, as New Zealand butter and cheese joined the cold procession north. At the receiving end, the London docks grew acres of insulated warehousing, and Smithfield market men learned to speak of cargoes by hemisphere and season, juggling the planet's calendars so that when the northern pastures slept, the southern ones fed them. The deeper magic was temporal as much as spatial. Freezing did not merely move meat, it moved time, letting January eat what December had raised on the far side of the equinox. Southern farmers now planned their lambing around dinner tables 11,000 miles away, and the price of hill country in Otago rose and fell with the appetite of Lancashire. It was, in the plainest sense, the moment the world began eating from a single table. There were casualties of the abundance. Of course, British and Irish graziers now competed with grass on the other side of the planet, and they said so, loudly, in Parliament and the farming press. But for the urban millions the arithmetic was unanswerable. Meat that had been a Sunday indulgence became a weekday expectation within a generation. Social historians ranked cheap imported protein among the quiet forces that improved the stature and health of the industrial working class by century's end, an improvement delivered not by any act of Parliament, but by machinery that could hold a ship's hold at 20 degrees of frost through the tropics. As for the Dunedin herself, the sea kept her ending private. In 1890, bound from New Zealand with another frozen cargo, she vanished with all 34 hands somewhere off the Southern Ocean, presumed lost to ice or storm, no wreckage ever confirmed. It is a strangely fitting fate for a ship whose whole achievement had been a negotiation with cold. So here is the connection to carry to dinner. Globalization, that vast abstraction, did not begin with container ships or the internet. For your dinner plate, it began on a becalmed clipper in the tropics in 1882, with a captain half frozen among the carcasses, sawing air holes so that a sheep from the bottom of the world could arrive, 98 days later, perfectly fresh at the top of it.